I was 36 years old when I experienced sepsis and septic shock. I'd just given birth to our daughter 10 months earlier. I'd actually only just recently returned to full-time work in the mortgage and finance industry. And when it happened to me, I'd never heard of sepsis before. If someone had have asked me what's sepsis, I probably would have had no idea. I may have said, is it the same as septicemia? But other than that, I would have had no idea what sepsis is. My incident with sepsis started, it was probably about 1 a.m. Our daughter was unsettled. She just needed to, have a parent there to put her back to sleep. So I'd reached my arm through her cot to give her a little bit of a pat. Didn't take long. And as I went to leave the room, I'd pulled my arm out from the cot and actually banged my elbow really hard on the cot, gave it a bit of a rub, thought, oh, gee, that was a bad knock to the funny bone, and went to bed. I woke up about 2 hours later and my elbow was really swollen, and I remember thinking, oh, surely that's not because of when I banged my elbow earlier. Maybe I've been bitten by a spider. But it was really painful, and it was so painful that I woke up my husband, which I normally wouldn't do. I woke him up and said, hey, look at this. Look how swollen my elbow is. I knocked it, but maybe I've been bitten by something. And he said, and I explained how much pain I was in. He said, well, maybe just have a couple of Panadol and go back to bed. So I did that. Then I woke up probably again about 5:30 in the morning. And by this time, the pain was really intense. The Panadol hadn't really done anything. And I was also starting at that point to feel a real sense that something else was wrong. Started to feel like you do when you're coming down with a virus, but it was really intense. So I got up and I actually sat in front of the heater because I was quite cold. And I remember one of the first things I remember is rocking backwards and forwards with the pain because I'd never experienced pain like that before. And then the other thing that started happening was my teeth started to chatter. And again, I had this overwhelming sense of dread that something really serious was wrong. So probably about after an hour of that, I woke my husband up and said, I need to go to hospital. Something's really wrong. I think perhaps I've dislocated my elbow when I knocked it and I didn't realise, but something's really wrong. So he got our daughter up, got dressed, we drove to the local hospital, and one of the most distinct things that I remember about that drive to the hospital was I turned to my husband and I said, I know this sounds really silly, and even though we're so close to the hospital, I feel like I should be in an ambulance. So we continued on to the hospital, and when we arrived in the ED, I spoke to the nurse at triage and explained that I think I've dislocated my elbow and I'm in a lot of pain. So from there, I remember I waited in the waiting room for about 20 to 30 minutes. I was also given pain relief there before I went through to ED. When I went through to the ED, I remember it was just mostly all about this dislocated elbow that I thought I had. Started off with x-rays. I do remember that they did mention something about an infection, and a line was drawn around the redness around my elbow so they could monitor that infection. But other than that, nothing really infection related was discussed. So yeah, really the first couple of hours were just about getting the x-rays, waiting for the results to see what had happened. They came back fine. After a couple of hours of being there, I remember that I was given IV antibiotics, and since my experience, I've actually had access to my file, and I have seen that at that point those antibiotics weren't broad spectrum. So from there, a couple of hours later, I was actually then, my antibiotics were changed and I was put on broad spectrum antibiotics, and by then it was getting closer towards lunchtime. The other thing that happened around that time was I had an ECG as a result of my rapid heart rate. And after my ECG, I remember the doctor, having a real puzzled look and asking me, did you have a bad heart as a child? And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, now this is about my heart. And just, really having no idea what was going on with me, not really having a sense of what they were looking for, apart from the fact that I was now receiving IV antibiotics and fluids, and it was still a bit of a mystery as to what was going on and that I was being monitored quite carefully. At one point, I got moved to another part of the emergency department, and at that point, I did have quite severe shivering and chills. I'd had that off and on throughout the morning. So I remember getting lots of really warm blankets. And I remember the nurses that were looking after me at that time were really concerned. And I think that's when I was moved back out to resus. And then throughout the afternoon, probably the most significant thing that happened was about 3 in the afternoon, an orthopaedic surgeon came and saw me, and he aspirated some fluid from my elbow and confirmed, yep, you've definitely got an infection in there. So we'll admit you and we'll perform surgery tomorrow to wash out your elbow to clear out the infection, and we'll keep you on the IV antibiotics. And so at that point I had a sense of relief. I felt it wasn't really about my heart anymore, and there wasn't I didn't have to worry about the puzzled looks. I felt that the doctor that knew what was going on had confirmed what was happening. I was having surgery the next day to fix it, and everything was going to be okay. So I continued to be monitored for the rest of the afternoon, and probably by late afternoon, evening, I said to my husband, you go home. Our daughter was 10 months old. I didn't think he needed to stay. I didn't really think there was anything to worry about. I felt that I was being looked after well and that everything was on track. So he went home, and about an hour after that, I remember that someone came to me and said they were from ICU and I needed to be checked by ICU just as part of the routine check. And I got the all clear from them that I was okay. So again, I felt, yep, everything's on track, all good. So I think I waited about another hour to be moved to the ward. And when I was moved to the ward, the nurse that checked my obs when I arrived there found that my blood pressure was 60/40 and let me know that she had to do something called a MET call and advised me that I was in septic shock. So then a team from ICU came down to assess me, and then things moved pretty quickly from there through to ICU. When I was moved from the ward to ICU, everything happened super quick. I remember they let me know that they needed to put in a central line and that I was being prepped straight away for surgery. They also, at one point, asked me if we could call my husband because it was really important that I spoke to him to let him know what was happening because it was so serious. And I think if I look back now, even in that moment and the fact that I've been taken to ICU, I had no understanding of how serious it was. And I can't remember what I said to my husband exactly, but he tells me that when he spoke to me, I was extremely calm and I didn't seem to be concerned over what was happening. And he said that, receiving a call that your wife's in ICU, obviously is quite worrying, but I apparently reassured him, I'm fine, don't worry about coming in, just see me in the morning when I wake, and I'll be awake after my surgery. So that was that. And then I went through for my emergency surgery, and I'm not sure exactly who it was. I think it was one of the doctors or nurses as I was being wheeled through for surgery. Actually said, Fiona, do you realise how sick you are? It's very serious. And I think in that moment, I suddenly realised how sick I actually was. And at that moment, I realised I might not wake up from this surgery. I might die. And because the way they said it, I just really felt like I was, really close to death. But it's really interesting in that moment, being so, potentially close to death, I actually had an overwhelming sense of calm because I felt like there's not much I can do about it. I'm either going to survive and fight this, or what will be will be. So I know it sounds strange, but I did feel quite calm. With that decision, I decided that if I wake up, I'm going to fight. So I remember waking up, I think in the early hours of the next morning, and I was on a ventilator. And I remember it was like my last thought of, if I wake up, I'm going to fight. It's like that, it was straight back into my mind. And I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, I've got to fight for my life. So I remember being really frustrated being on a ventilator because I just wanted to breathe for myself. And I remember actually trying to breathe around the tube and then being sedated again. And then when I woke up later the next day, the ventilator was gone and I was breathing on my own, and that was much better. And pretty much my experience in ICU from there was pretty good. After ICU, I think that throughout my time in ICU, I did hear the word septic shock maybe a couple of times. And because I'd heard it that first time when the nurse did the MET call, it was in my mind then. But after that, I definitely never heard the words septic shock again. And I certainly, throughout the whole experience, never heard the word sepsis. So yeah, interestingly, from high dependency onwards and then through to the ward and my discharge, I never actually got explained, it was never explained to me what had happened. It was just very much about the infection, the antibiotics. You're on IV now. When you get discharged, you'll move to oral antibiotics and then you'll be okay. So yeah, it's really interesting when I reflect on that time, because I did have a lot of time now that things weren't as serious, to, I guess, understand what had happened to me. And when I reflect on it, I think, I realised that I really didn't there was no explanation of what had happened and what my body had been through and exactly what was going on. So then when I was finally discharged, I received my discharge letter that I needed to take with me to my GP. And again, no real explanation of what had happened. In my mind was, okay, I've had a really serious infection. It got quite intense. You went to ICU. I also, by the way, got hospital-acquired pneumonia while I was there. So in my discharge letter, I also referred to that and the fact that that also needed to be followed up by my GP. But other than that, I expected to make a full recovery quite quickly. I was now on oral antibiotics. I'd been on antibiotics previously in my life. So I thought once I finished this course, I should be feeling great and life should go back to normal. Probably about a week, maybe a week and a half after I was discharged from hospital, my husband and daughter and I, we went to our local GP for the follow-up, and I took my discharge letter from the hospital. And I think at that stage I was still, in that real mindset that, I'll finish this course of antibiotics and everything will be fine. So when I went into the GP and she was quite upbeat, it was actually surprising to me that she did make a comment and say, what you've just been through is pretty intense, pretty huge. But then the other thing about that appointment was that she really focused on the fact that I'd had hospital-acquired pneumonia, and that seemed to take up the majority of that appointment. And I remember leaving thinking the most important thing I need to do as a next step is go and get my 3-month post-pneumonia chest x-ray as a follow-up, and that was the priority for me. But apart from that, again, no mention of the word sepsis or septic shock, no discussion about what that was or what I'd been through or what I should expect afterwards, and also no information for my husband, which was similar in the hospital. There was, no information. So in the few months that followed that, after my discharge from hospital and seeing my GP, I think that was probably the hardest part of the whole experience for me, because even though it was traumatic what happened in hospital, I don't think I really understood what was going on, and it all happened so fast and I felt like I was in where I needed to be, so I didn't really panic too much. But what happened when I was at home and I started to experience things that I didn't understand, I felt very alone. I wasn't sure where to turn to. I thought I was being a hypochondriac, and I thought that I just needed to, suck it up and get on with it. So some of the things that I was experiencing were anxiety. I'd experienced anxiety before in my life, but never anxiety like this. I was terrified of even getting the slightest cold, or not just myself, but also, my husband, my daughter, my friends and family. I was really, overly sensitive about if anyone had any symptoms. So I had, and it wasn't just even that. I just had, general anxiety that I couldn't explain. I also had some of my hair falling out in parts. Probably the biggest challenge I had in the first few weeks was work. Work were, aware of how serious it had been when the incident happened, because I'd been in ICU and I'd had this serious infection. But in their mind, I'd had a really bad infection in my arm. Part of my job requires me to work out on the road, driving around for my appointments. And I remember my conversation with my boss was about, when's your arm going to be right for you to get back to work? And I remember thinking, gee, if only it was only about my arm. I just felt lethargic. I felt like, I had insomnia. I just felt generally unwell and anxious, and like I just couldn't get on with normal day-to-day life. In the end, I probably went back to work way too soon. I think it was only less than a month before I was back at full-time work. And I really did that out of just feeling like I was just being a bit of a sook. So because I felt like I was quite alone and I was searching for answers, and I really didn't feel like my GP had thought there was anything for me to worry about, what I did was I started looking into what had happened. I've grabbed my discharge letter again, and, you know, just to look for clues of, you know, maybe there was something in there that I missed that's happened that, you know, could explain why I'm feeling so terrible. So, and that's when I stumbled on the word septic shock again. And I remembered, that's right, that's what was mentioned by the nurse that did the Met call for me to go to ICU. And I remembered that was mentioned in ICU a couple of times. What's this septic shock? So I decided to Google it, and then discovered what septic shock actually is and what sepsis is. And what was described, you know, as far as, you know, what people experience post-sepsis was just about everything that I'd been feeling. And suddenly I was so relieved to find an explanation for what I'd been feeling. So then I found the Sepsis Alliance in the US, their website. I found the UK Sepsis Trust in the UK, and there was so much information on there, which was really helpful. And the other thing that I found was on Facebook. I found at least probably a dozen different sepsis support groups around the world. So from that, I was able to communicate with others that had experienced the same as me, and that was a massive lifeline for me and really changed my life because at that point, because I really was feeling so alone, and suddenly I had all these people that I could reach out to and feel like I wasn't so alone. And one of the things that I did probably 7 or 8 months later is I actually started an Australia and New Zealand sepsis support group because there wasn't one. And I still run that today, that provides support for people like me that have nowhere to go, because unfortunately there still really isn't anything formal in place for Australians to go if they're looking for support post-sepsis. If I had the whole experience over again, what I would love to have seen happen differently, first of all, I would have loved to have known exactly what sepsis was before it happened to me, so that perhaps when I was feeling what I was at home, I would have been able to identify that I had, you know, the shivering, teeth chattering, that I had a fever, and that my heart rate was rapid. And, you know, that's 3 of the classic signs of sepsis. Perhaps then when I presented to the ED, I might have been able to describe and call out those symptoms better, rather than saying, oh, I've got a sore elbow, I think it's dislocated. I'm not saying that it wouldn't have been picked up anyway, but I just feel like having an understanding of what might be going on with you and being able to call that out can make a real difference. Along those similar lines, once I got through to ED, I would have loved for the staff to be able to call out to me what they were looking for, and that potentially sepsis was on the table, because that certainly didn't happen. I would have loved a poster on the wall or a pamphlet handed to myself or to my family that were there with me, being just as confused and worried about, you know, what's going on. You know, there's this infection going on. We're monitoring that infection. We're checking Fiona's heart, but, you know, what's going on? So I really would have liked to have experienced that in ED, because I think that would have been able to, again, help me call out symptoms. And now seeing my medical file, you know, I know one of the classic signs of sepsis is low urine output. And if I look back now, I don't think I went to the bathroom that whole day, because I was hooked up to IV fluids and antibiotics. And I think I would have remembered if I needed to, you know, go to the toilet with everything hooked up to me. And I don't recall going to the toilet, and I don't recall my urine output being measured. So had I been aware that that was one of the signs of sepsis that, you know, could have been monitored, I probably would have, you know, called that out. I think also, you know, I guess it does play on my mind. Had sepsis been talked about openly earlier on, I feel like, you know, maybe things would have happened differently. Maybe would I have had broad spectrum antibiotics sooner? Would I have ever ended up in ICU? I guess we'll never know. But yeah, that does play on your mind. The other thing I would have liked to have seen happen is that I know that septic shock was mentioned during my Met call and when I was in ICU, but again, that was never explained to me. And then again, when I left ICU and was in high dependency in the ward, was never mentioned, never explained. I was discharged without any information and had no proper understanding of what had happened. Similarly, when we went to the GP, and again, I didn't really have a proper understanding of what had happened, I would have found it so useful to have a pamphlet about what to expect post-sepsis, where I can go for support. You know, if you're feeling anxiety, reach out to your GP and perhaps you could look at a mental health plan. But everything I was, you know, experiencing post-septic shock was that, you know, this is the plan now to get you better, and that, you know, you should be right within a couple of weeks. And then probably finally, I wish that, you know, like I said, I wish I understood what sepsis was before it happened to me. I wish that, you know, my boss understood what sepsis was, my work colleagues, my friends and family, because had they understood what it was and there was better public awareness, then I perhaps wouldn't have had the experience I did when I wanted to return to work, as far as, you know, feeling like I was, you know, just being a hypochondriac or, you know, not sucking it up and getting on with it, because had they understood what sepsis was and the seriousness of septic shock, then I wouldn't have felt like I had to apologise for what I was experiencing. And I think finally, I wish there was also, you know, that post-sepsis support. When I did stumble across the Sepsis Alliance in America, and in particular the Sepsis Trust in the UK, I discovered that they have support groups in their local communities. So that's something that I would really love to see in Australia, and we certainly don't have yet. But hopefully with the work that the Australian Sepsis Network is doing, that we will eventually get there, because I think that's really important.